Yes, Europe is a garden. We have built a garden. Everything works. It's the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that the humankind has been able to build. The rest of the world, and you know very well, Federica, is not exactly a garden. The rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, is a jungle.
A bold statement, but a lie. For centuries, Europe was the jungle, the deadliest continent in human history. Twice in the last century alone, it consumed itself in wars so catastrophic that over 100 million people died. Only after those wars exhausted Europe, only after the continent was carved into American and Soviet spheres of influence, did it become the so-called garden. Its peace wasn't natural, it was engineered. Washington suppressed Europe's nationalism, shackled its independence, and built a collective security system that served US power. And today, with the Ukraine war killing over 1 million people, even the garden metaphor collapses. The weeds are back, and they're spreading. But if Europe was cultivated into a so-called garden, the Middle East was engineered to become a jungle. Where Europe was stitched together, the Middle East was torn apart. Where Europeans were conditioned to settle disputes at the table, the people of the Middle East were encouraged to fight on battlefields. Contrary to mainstream propaganda, the instability in the Middle East isn't because the people of the region are culturally savage, backwards animals fighting to resolve ancient conflicts. It's because American power wanted it that way. In this video, we'll explore how the United States organized stability and security in Europe, chaos in the Middle East, and why the engineering of insecurity itself is one of Washington's most powerful weapons in the region. After 1945, Europe was in ruins. Tens of millions dead, cities bombed into ash. The world's most advanced societies had proven they could destroy themselves better than anyone else. For Washington, this was a golden opportunity. By taking the lead in reconstruction and the responsibility for security, the US could shape Europe's future, not as a rival, but as a loyal subject. So the United States built what political scientist Carl Deutsch called a security community. The idea was simple. If nations were tied together, economically, militarily, and politically, war between them would become unthinkable. That meant crushing the independence and sovereignty of European states. So the US collectivized Western Europe into a unified military bloc by establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO. This was done in order to serve American interests and served three purposes at once. It gave US corporations privileged access to European markets. It forced Europe to rely on American manufacturers for weapons and defense, and it made Europe dependent on the United States for protection against the Soviet Iron Curtain. Perhaps the most important fact is this. America didn't come to Europe during World War II to liberate it from Nazi Germany. It came to replace Germany as the occupier, because after the war, the US never left. It built permanent military bases, embedded itself into Europe's political and economic architecture, and crowned itself as the continent's hegemon. Europe's peace, therefore, wasn't born from morality or progress. Contrary to Europe's propaganda of exceptionalism, its stability and prosperity didn't emerge from Enlightenment ideals or higher values. It was engineered by imperial design to serve imperial interests. Washington turned Europe into the world's most successful garden, not because it loved Europe, but because a stable, dependent Europe served American interests. But even here, there was a limit. Notice who wasn't invited into the garden: Russia. After the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Washington could have dismantled NATO or, at the very least, brought Moscow into the fold. Instead, it maintained Russia as the enemy and expanded NATO eastward, inviting only the former Soviet states like Poland and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Because America doesn't integrate powerful rivals, it must break them apart first. So just as the Soviet Union was balkanized, so too would Russia have to be fractured before it could ever be welcomed into any kind of security community. That is the real lesson of Europe's so-called garden. You see, peace, stability, and security exists only where US power has already divided, conquered, and reshaped the landscape. So if Europe became a garden by design, then the Middle East was engineered into a jungle. Where Washington suppressed nationalism in Europe, it inflamed it in the Middle East. Where disputes in Europe were resolved through diplomacy and negotiations, disputes in the Middle East were handled with coups, invasions, and regime change. It wasn't because the region was inherently chaotic, it was because American power required it to be so. The Middle East was never meant to be a community of peace. It was meant to be a battlefield of insecurity that could be exploited and manipulated. This is the key difference between US foreign policy in Europe and US foreign policy in the Middle East. In Europe, it's understood that insecurity for one nation means insecurity for all nations. Insecurity is therefore addressed via diplomacy and institutions built to ensure that armed conflict never arises. This is how and why rivals like France, England, and Germany have been able to dissolve historically fortified borders for trade, tourism, and industrialization. In the Middle East, on the other hand, the US encourages instability. Instead of organizations like the European Union or NATO collectivizing security or economic concerns, the US deploys institutions like the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, or the National Endowment for Democracy to stoke discord, organize coups, arm designated terror organizations as proxy groups, and pit nations against one another. Instead of snuffing out insecurity for one nation, it instigates and exacerbates it for all nations. This desire to produce insecurity fuels racist rhetoric, framing chaos and instability as inherent flaws of Middle Eastern people rather than the deliberate design of US foreign policy. When American politicians talk about the Middle East, they don't describe it as a region with history, complexity, or politics. They view it through the racist lens of Orientalism, describing it as a problem of mindless and inherent savagery.
Think about the savagery, just the sheer, unrestrained savagery that we have seen across the Middle East and the Arab world.
I think Islam hates us. There's something there that there's a tremendous hatred there. There's a tremendous hatred. We have to get to the bottom of it.
They are threatening. They bring that desert stuff to our world.
I can't trust Obama. He's an Arab. No?
No, ma'am. He's a decent family man.
At the core of these Orientalist views are three core claims. The first claim is that the region is doomed by ancient rivalries.
Middle East is going through a transformation that will play out for a generation, rooted in conflicts that date back millennia.
Tragic turmoil in the Middle East runs back to the dawn of history.
You've been rivals for centuries.
This is a myth. Iran and Saudi Arabia didn't even exist as nation-states until the 20th century, and they were actually allies up until the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The sectarian divide didn't explode until after the Islamic Revolution of Iran toppled the Shah. Then it was politicized and weaponized. So the ancient hatred story isn't history, it's propaganda. The second claim is that the Middle East is just irrational and violent.
You know why they hate us? Yeah, I talked to intelligence people all weekend. They hate us because of their religion. They hate us because of their culture, and they hate us because of peer pressure.
But this isn't accurate. It's racism dressed up as analysis. Religious and cultural strife isn't unique to the Middle East. It's a common issue, primarily exacerbated by power struggles all throughout human history. Consider the fact that in the centuries prior to the modern era, wars were waged over differences in religious beliefs. The Protestant and Catholic wars in Europe, also known as the European Wars of Religion, were a series of conflicts fought primarily in the 16th and 17th centuries, triggered by the Protestant Reformation in 1517. It's estimated that 6.5 to 17 million people were slaughtered during these wars. These racist views consistently ignore that Europe was the most violent continent on Earth until 1945. Twice in 30 years, it plunged the world into total war. Despite this history, American officials never described Europeans as inherently violent. Another example is how the West portrays hatred of Israel as ancient anti-Semitism instead of a reasonable disdain for colonialism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide.
On a sacred Jewish holiday, the terrorist group Hamas unleashed the deadliest day of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Driven by ancient desire to wipe out the Jewish people off the face of the earth,
This idea isn't just espoused by politicians or mainstream academics. It's propagated in Hollywood as well in order to obfuscate the truth and cause confusion.
Oh, and I went to a class on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Wow.
I mean, it's hard to pick up in the middle. I might take it next semester. I mean, it's so dicked up over there. And no one knows who started it?
And the third claim is that it's all about oil and resources.
I can no longer tolerate them in Carbomia. Do you realize how much of our oil they're stealing? As Supreme Military Commander, King of Kings, and President for life of the Socialist Democratic Federated Republic of Carbomia, I order you Decepticons out of my country by sunset tomorrow. Do you like gold? Gold? Yes, this is something that interests Abdul Fakati. But it would take all the gold of the United States to persuade me to let you stay here another day. I have made my decision. You may remain in Carbomia, but only until the next crescent moon. And Triptychon will be on strict rations of 1,000 barrels of oil a day.
And I need your word that you'll never cooperate with the Decepticons again.
Oh, you have my word of honor, Rodimus. In fact, I swear to you on the grave of my mother's camel, and my uncle's goat, and even my sister's donkey.
Oil only becomes a security issue when states are forced to think in zero-sum terms, when their survival depends on controlling it. That thinking didn't emerge naturally from the region. It was imposed by empire. In Europe, Norway isn't demonized for its vast energy resources or the domination of fossil fuel exports on the continent. Nor is France vilified for being the largest net exporter of energy on the continent via its nuclear programs. Because they are part of the US engineered security community, their participation in the energy markets aren't considered to be a threat. In the Middle East, however, nations like Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Iran are demonized and targeted for their resources and their participation in an economic system that is supposedly a free, competitive market. The Orientalist lens views oil in the Middle East as dangerous, negative, and corrupt, propagating the idea that it must be controlled by the West. In Europe, however, it is viewed as a precious commodity crucial to trade and industry in constant need of investment and innovation. The truth is simple. The Middle East is insecure, not because of culture, religion, or resources, but because Washington designs and exploits it that way. Instead of building a security community like it did in Europe, America built a regime of insecurity, one where coups, proxy wars, and regime change have become the norm. So if Europe was bound together by integration, the Middle East was pulled apart by manipulation. Washington didn't build a community, it built a battlefield. And at the heart of this battlefield is a strategy known as multi-balancing. Multi-balancing means playing every side against one another at once, supporting allies, threatening rivals, and sometimes arming both of them at the same time. It's not about stability, it's about keeping the region permanently unstable so that no power can ever rise independently of US control. The most severe tool in this strategy is regime change. When a government steps out of line, it is overthrown by coup, by invasion, or by proxy. Regime change isn't an accident of policy, it's the enforcement mechanism of insecurity. These regime change operations often take place in nations that are obvious opponents of US foreign policy, such as Iran, Syria, Iraq, or Libya. But they are sometimes wielded against allies as well. For example, in 2016, there was a coup attempt against President Erdogan in Turkey. While the US condemned it, the Turkish interior minister blamed the United States, accusing it of helping to orchestrate it behind the scenes. After surviving the coup attempt, President Donald Trump waged an aggressive currency war against Turkey just 2 years later, announcing double tariffs on Turkish exports, which caused an inflation spiral, severely devaluing the lira. This aggression was meant to put Turkey back in its place after years of aggressive foreign policy in places like Syria and Egypt. Washington divided the Middle East into 3 interconnected arenas, each governed by its own rules of imbalance. The Near East. Here, America guarantees Israel's military supremacy with billions of dollars of weapons and decades of unconditional support. Every rival, from Egypt to Syria to Iran, is kept weaker by design to ensure no one can ever challenge Israel's dominance. Then you have the Persian Gulf. The monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula, from Saudi Arabia to the UAE, are armed and protected to serve as a bulwark work against Iran. These regimes are some of the most repressive on earth, but their survival is guaranteed as long as they keep playing America's game. And then you have South Asia. Pakistan is used as a tool to balance contradictory interests, whether it's against India, with the Taliban, against the Taliban, whatever it is depending on the day. Washington will prop up a state like Pakistan just enough to be useful, but never enough to be stable. Together, these arenas do not form a community. They form an insecurity system, a patchwork of rivalries where peace is impossible by design. Inside this system of insecurity and instability, states have no choice but to play by the rules the game inherently creates. These nations have to choose a stance towards America. They have to compete with their regional rivals, they have to repress their own population, and they must procure non-state actors and proxy groups as allies. Let's start with the first one, choosing your stance toward America. The insecurity forces nations to make extreme decisions. They must either wholly support or wholly resist the United States. Siding with US power gains a nation sophisticated weapons and access to markets, but sacrifices sovereignty. Resisting US control invites sanctions, sabotage, or regime change. Competition with regional rivals. The insecurity produces constant competition, forcing nations to undermine one another in order to produce some level of security at home. Iran, for example, faces encirclement by US bases and their allies. This requires Iran to get involved with their neighbors' affairs. Saudi Arabia also funds proxies and political movements to counter Iran. Their rivalry feeds the insecurity system, and it's a deadly feedback loop. The insecurity produces rivalries, which in turn produces more insecurity, which in turn escalates the rivalries. The intense proxy wars between Iran and Saudi Arabia best exemplify this. Controlling your own people. Governments must repress dissent just enough to survive, but not so much that they collapse. Those targeted by the US are most vulnerable to uprisings and coups. This targeting produces more repression as the nations cannot rely solely on the judgment and understanding of their own people to see through the sanctions or engineered color revolutions, as the common man is simply more interested in the price of bread than reading policy papers from the Pentagon. Syria is a good example of this. Syria was under extreme pressure, so its government resorted to extreme tactics of repression. The Syrian government went too far, playing right into the hands of US regime change plans, fomenting a rebellion turned proxy war that ultimately destroyed the country, producing millions of refugees and eventually toppling the regime. Management of non-state actors. From Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen to ISIS in Iraq and Syria, militias and movements are both weapons and threats. States in the region are forced to either ally with them, produce or crush them, or outsource them, but never, ever can they ignore them. So in this game, violence and repression isn't a breakdown of order. It is the order. This is the American regime of insecurity, a system where coups, wars, and sectarian conflict are not failures of policy, but the policy itself. And once it was established, every actor in the region, friend and foe alike, was forced to play by its rules. So who actually builds and maintains this system? Who decides which states rise, which ones fall, and which ones burn? It isn't just the President of the United States. It's something larger, deeper, something permanent. The American Foreign Policy Establishment. This establishment is a web of three overlapping groups: the government, the think tanks, and elite academia. Together, they form the machinery that manufactures both policy and the narratives that justify it. Let's start with the government. Cabinet officials, intelligence agencies, members of Congress, and their staff, they implement the decisions. But they are only the visible layer, the operators of the machine, not the designers. That's where think tanks come in. This is where the blueprints are drawn. Think tanks sell themselves as research institutions, but in reality, they are advocacy groups with a mission to shape both public opinion and policy. They produce reports and policy papers. They supply the experts to cable news, where they can propagate their ideas, and they funnel their own members into government positions. It's a revolving door. Staffers go from think tanks into government. They go from the government back into the think tanks, all the while carrying the same worldview and agenda. Finally, you have academia. Prestigious universities provide the intellectual cover. Professors of international relations and security studies move seamlessly between classrooms, government appointments, and think tank boards. They train the next generation of policymakers and reinforce the assumptions of the old guard. Let's take a look at the Kagan family. The Kagan family is a perfect example of how the establishment works. Robert Kagan, a think tank fellow, Washington Post columnist, and advisor to Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney. Then you have Frederick Kagan, a military historian at the American Enterprise Institute, one of the architects of the Iraq surge. And Kimberly Kagan, founder of the Institute for the Study of War, producing reports that shaped U.S. operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan. You also have Donald Kagan, the patriarch, a Yale professor shaping academic orthodoxy for decades. You also have none other than Victoria Nuland, Robert's wife, a career diplomat who served under both Republicans and Democrats from Dick Cheney's office to Obama's State Department. She is most famous for the debacle in Ukraine. The Kagans are just one family connected to media, academia, think tanks, and government, together influencing wars that killed hundreds of thousands. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's the system working exactly as designed. By the way, in case you're wondering, yes, the Kagan family are also pro-Israel Jewish Zionists. In 1997, Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol founded the Project for the New American Century. Its members included neocons Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz. In a 2000 report called Rebuilding America's Defenses, the PNAC argued that the U.S. must be ready to, quote, fight and decisively win multiple simultaneous major theater wars. 1 year later, 9/11 happened. And the same people who signed the PNAC's documents were in the Bush administration, launching wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is how insecurity is produced, not by accident, not by one party or another, but by a permanent establishment. A deep state network of officials, academics, and think tank operatives who move in and out of government while always keeping the same mission alive: preserving American imperial primacy at all costs.
Right after 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. Oh, I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
When it comes to foreign policy, Republicans and Democrats speak different languages, but ultimately carry out the same mission. The American foreign policy establishment is bipartisan, and its goal is permanent: preserving U.S. dominance. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter declared that any attempt to control the Persian Gulf would be seen as an attack on U.S. vital interests. This Carter Doctrine meant that America would use military force to secure the region's oil. A decade later, Bill Clinton bombed Iraq repeatedly, kept crippling sanctions in place that took the lives of 1 million Iraqis, and spoke openly about the need to remove Saddam Hussein. He didn't start the Iraq War, but he laid the groundwork for it. And of course, George W. Bush invaded both Afghanistan and Iraq. He justified the Iraq invasion with claims of weapons of mass destruction.
Saddam Hussein and his regime will stop at nothing until something stops him.
Powell argued Iraq is deceiving the weapons inspectors.
Claims that were ultimately proven false. But by the time the truth had been revealed, Iraq had already been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people were dead, and the U.S. was entrenched in another expensive military quagmire.
When I look out over this crowd today, I know there is no shortage of patriots or patriotism. What I do oppose is a dumb war.
Barack Obama campaigned against dumb wars, but once in office, he escalated drone strikes, expanded covert operations, and bombed both Libya and Syria. He also kept George W. Bush's defense secretary, Robert Gates, proving that party labels don't stop the machine. Carter, Clinton, Bush, Obama, different faces, same logic. Every administration treated the Middle East not as a region to stabilize, but as a chessboard to dominate. And each left the region weaker, poorer, and more violent than before. This continuity of chaos is the point. America's foreign policy establishment doesn't change with elections, it survives them. And because it survives, so does the regime of insecurity. And the consequences of that is a region in ruins. After decades of coups, wars, and regime change, the results are undeniable. The Middle East is less secure than ever before. From sanctions in the 1990s to the 2003 invasion and occupation, Iraq has been shattered. Hundreds of thousands killed, millions displaced. Today the country is carved into sectarian enclaves, exploited by regional powers, and completely ungovernable. Washington's covert war to overthrow the Assad regime turned Syria into a battlefield for regional and international powers. Nearly 1 million people were killed. Sanctions starved the country into extreme poverty and produced millions of refugees. Even with Assad now gone, the new Syrian regime is unable to control much of the country's territory and now faces the impossible challenge of governing a nation that has multiple separatist groups and militias carving up their own microstates, influenced and controlled by foreign powers. It is effectively an ungovernable failed state, lacking the means to defend itself against Israel, Turkey, Iran, or any other nations attempting to meddle in their affairs. In 2011, NATO destroyed the Libyan state, assassinating Muammar Gaddafi. Hillary Clinton infamously laughed, "We came, we saw, he died."
He came, we saw, he died.
The US-backed Saudi war on Yemen created the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands of people were killed by bombs, millions starved in a famine, and its cities were reduced to rubble. And of course you have Palestine. For over 50 years, Palestinians have lived under occupation, siege, and periodic massacres, all guaranteed by US weapons and diplomatic cover for Israel. Gaza, as one of the most densely populated open-air prisons in human history, now faces a genocide perpetrated by the genocidal apartheid military colony that the US has propped up for decades. Encircled by American bases, hammered by sanctions, and constantly threatened with war, Iran survives, but only by bracing for permanent confrontation. The recent 12-day war between Iran and Israel nearly escalated into a major world war and will most certainly be continued at a later date. Every move Iran makes is judged through the lens of US-engineered insecurity. In every case, the same logic applies. Instability is not a failure of US policy. It is the policy. Where Europe was bound together into a beautiful garden, the Middle East was deliberately torn into a chaotic jungle, and it cost tens of millions of people their lives, their property, their prosperity. Entire nations have been reduced to rubble. Generations condemned to grow up in war zones, their futures traded for the illusion of American security. But the story doesn't end with destruction, because the American regime of insecurity isn't just about keeping the Middle East weak. It's about waiting for the right moment, when the region is divided enough, broken enough, and conquered enough to finally build the kind of security community Washington wants. The question is, what happens next? One possibility is that America retreats. Wary of endless wars, drowning in debt, and facing challenges in East Asia, Washington could simply pull back and leave the region to its own fate. But history offers little evidence that empires leave voluntarily. Another possibility is that America is forced out. That resistance, whether it's from Iran, non-state actors, militias, or rising regional coalitions, they will eventually bleed Washington dry until the costs outweigh the benefits. This is the scenario America fears the most: expulsion through exhaustion. But there is a third possibility. The Middle East is divided and weakened until no state can resist. And then, just as in Europe, America finally builds its version of a security community. Not one based on equality or peace, but on submission, dependence, and extreme exploitation. The signs are already there. US pressure for normalization between Israel and Arab monarchies, Saudi Arabia's push for NATO-style guarantees, and the Abraham Accords. All of these are experiments in building a collective order, but on Washington's terms. So the real endgame isn't just retreat or expulsion. It could actually be American success. A Middle Eastern garden planted on top of the ruins of sovereignty and independence, and of course, only for the elite. The entire point of divide and conquer is to conquer. And until that endgame is reached, Washington will keep the region in the jungle. Because insecurity isn't a failure of US policy, it's its greatest weapon. Now, these videos take a tremendous amount of time and effort on my part, so if you could support my work, please consider making a donation. The link is pinned in the comment section. Of course, I'd like to hear what you think, so let me know in the comment section. Is there anything that I'm missing? Is there anything you found interesting? Let me know. This documentary was inspired by Professor Majid Sharifi, who we have interviewed on this channel several times. He actually produced his own documentary about this subject several years ago based on his book, Insecurity: Communities of South Asia and the Middle East, The Consequences of US Foreign Policy. If you'd like to purchase his book or watch his documentary, take a look at the description to find links to his work. Thank you, and take care.
Trust nothing.